Share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that all right?
Yep, looks good.
Sounds good. So this is today's agenda.
All right. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to our June 5th Regional Planning Commission meeting, and our welcome to anyone that is new. And do we have any new members?
I don't believe so.
No.
Not that I
So
was.
welcome back, everyone. And we have a guest speaker tonight. So that will be great to have Gregory here with us. Next item on the agenda is going to be the adoption of our minutes from June 5th of 2025. So would someone like to make a motion to approve the minutes?
So, Jen, I think today's June 5th.
What did I say?
Well, you said what's on the minutes, on the slide, but
Oh,
it's actually March 6th.
Sorry,
March
yes,
6th.
March 6th.
Oh, okay.
Which is correct on the actual minutes itself. Apologies.
Okay, so, okay, yeah.
So would someone like to make the March 6th meetings? Would someone like to make a motion for those minutes to approve them?
Yeah, Bill Rice, Simsbury moves to adopt the minutes as submitted. Well, actually, as amended. I guess the minutes are correct. So, as submitted.
Can I hear a second?
From Canton, I second the motion.
Any further comments or corrections? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion
Mr.
carries.
Antonio Enfield, I'm abstaining since
Okay.
I missed it.
Any other abstentions? Okay, motion carries. Okay, next item that we have is a presentation by Tony Jordan and Greg Vaca. What to know about parking, understanding parking regulations that meet the needs of community and developers. And I'll have Caitlin introduce Tony and Greg.
All right, great. So I'm going to turn over to Tony Gregg in just a second. But I first wanted to set the stage for their parking conversation by just mentioning briefly, very briefly, some recent parking related legislation. So if you haven't been following specifically House Bill 5002, this might feel a little overwhelming, like you're drinking from the fire hose. But just bear with me because I think it's a good idea to internalize what you can of these three things that I'm going to mention as we head into this conversation. So the first thing is per House Bill 5002, which now has a public act number. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head and might still be awaiting the governor's signature. But right now, as it stands, it lays out that no community may reject an application for development solely on the basis that such development fails to conform with any requirements for off-street parking, unless the lack of such parking will have a specific adverse impact on public health and safety. So that's the first thing that's in there. First of many, but of the three we're talking about right now. The second, it amends the sort of zoning enabling legislation that you sort of all work under. So section 8-2 of the statutes, that section is being amended. And it's being amended to stipulate that zoning regulations shall no longer require a minimum parking number of off-street motor vehicle parking spaces for any residential development. So again, no minimum parking requirements for residential development. Related to that, the third thing that I want to mention is there are provisions that do allow towns to require applicants to provide parking assessments for residential developments that are large, 24 or more units. So those three things flagging for you now. Obviously, that and many other things are going to require you to amend your regulations in the coming months. So again, just let that marinate while you listen to Tony and Greg tonight. I'm now going to introduce Tony and Greg. We're joined by Tony Jordan. He is the president of the national organization known as the Parking Reform Network. They are focused on educating the public and communities about the impact of various parking policies on sort of all things from climate change, equity, to housing and traffic. We're also joined by Greg Vaca, who is the founder and president of Grava Properties. We're excited to have you here tonight because he is based locally in the Prague region out of Windsor. Greg's firm is committed to revitalizing historic town centers by creating vibrant and sustainable living and business spaces, and also has a passion for transit-oriented development in particular. So I want to thank Tony and Greg for attending tonight. I'm hoping folks are going to have a lot of questions for them. To that end, though, make sure I think it makes sense to hold them until the end. So either jot them down or do feel free to throw them in the chat, and then we'll try to get to them at the end of the presentation. And that's it from me. I'm going to turn it over to Tony first.
Hello. Hello. Thank you all for having me. Hope you can hear me and see my slides. My name is Tony Jordan. As mentioned, I'm the president of the Parking Reform Network. Thank you for being here and hearing what I have to say. We're going to talk about parking policy reforms. I'm going to start by just acknowledging something. Some of you may know who this guy is, some of you may not. Earlier this year, we lost Professor Donald Shoup. He was a professor at UCLA. He was a mentor. And the reason I mentioned him is because this guy is a Connecticut connection. He went to Yale for his undergraduate and graduate schooling. Starting in the late 70s and up through the mid 2000s, Professor Shoup really is the person who kind of dug into parking policy and looked at what we were doing with parking mandates and what their impacts were on affordability and land use, and popularized this. And I wouldn't have this organization without his mentorship and guidance, and he's dearly missed. Okay. The Parking Reform Network, thank you for the introduction. I won't go too much into this. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We are advocacy organization with hundreds of members around the country working, and they are professionals. They are academics, journalists, activists. We have partner organizations everywhere, and we really just do work on all things parking related, providing resources and just kind of tracking what's happening. I'm here to talk to you about the parking problem. And what parking problem, if you ask an average person, you might get various different answers about what the parking problem is. They will probably tell you that there's not enough parking and it costs too much. And I'm here to say that I think it's kind of the opposite. I think we have a lot of parking in many of our cities and towns in this country. It's misallocated, poorly placed, and underpriced. And this has led over many decades to higher rents, sprawling land use, environmental quality issues. I didn't come to this knowledge as a planner. I read Professor Shoup's book about 15 years ago. And I think most people think about parking just as a natural part of the environment almost. Like, why is it there? Why is this parking lot here? How big is it? And once you kind of dig in, which I think many of you probably have more than most, you might see that, to me, I see the parking spaces as cost, how much money they cost, how much space they take up, the ghosts of what was maybe in that space before, and also the promise of what could be in these parking spaces in the future. I want to start, and I'm guessing there's a various amount of expertise and knowledge on this, but talking about parking mandates. Parking mandates are in your zoning code. They're a table or sometimes just some text lines that say how much parking should be for every land use. And I'll mention that in preparation for this, I did actually look up about 30 regional parking mandates or sets of parking mandates in the capital region. Parking mandates came about back in the 40s and 50s as well. Initially, prior to parking mandates, if you wanted to build something, shopping center or housing development, your architect and your planner and the developer would get together and kind of pick a number of parking spaces to build. As this planning advisory service memo says from 1954, there's no correct answer, and they would just guess a number of stalls, and invariably it was too many or too few. And that was kind of how it went, and that got put into zoning codes. But unless you really, I think, go around and look at a bunch of different parking mandates, it's very difficult to actually see how this played out. So I'm going to share a couple slides about parking mandates. And this is the funny part of my presentation before we get into kind of the impacts. So I love bowling alley parking requirements because they are all over the place. And so when I looked through the cities in the COG, I found a spread between 2 per alley and 8 per alley or lane, depending on the city, for various cities and everything in between. And this is not special for Connecticut or your region. I have a thing I'm starting to call Jordan's rule of lane variability, which is that if you look at about 30 or 40 cities, pretty much anywhere in the United States, you'll find a spread between 2 and 8 per lane for bowling alleys. And I think it's worth wondering why. Do people in Ellington carpool more than people in West Hartford? Is there some reason for this? And the answer I really believe is no. It's arbitrary, and probably if there was a bowl, it either depended on the consultant that showed up or just what had kind of been built in the environment around the 60s and 70s when these codes went into place. It's not just bowling alleys. I love funeral homes too. Here we have chapels. You want to build a funeral home in the region, 5 per chapel in Willington, down to 40 per chapel in Farmington. This is another spread of 8 times the amount of parking for one use to another. What could possibly explain this? If you know, send me an email. I'd love to hear it. I can't figure it out. It's worth thinking about what these numbers really mean, right? If you think about no parking required and a building can possibly take up the entire footprint, the total FAR, the floor area ratio allowed, you can build dense Main Street type developments. 1 space per 500 square feet, not too terrible. A parking space takes up 300 to 400 square feet, so the building still can have more floor area than the parking lot. But once you get below 300 square feet, 1 per 300 square feet, you're really talking about more strip mall or highway type development, where if you're getting to 100 or below, you're really talking about auto-oriented uses primarily. I couldn't help but look at more funeral homes in the region, and here you have a spread for square footage between 200 and 25 per square feet. When you're getting below 50 per square feet, which is common for like bars, you're really talking a lot of parking, right? 50 square feet would be like 6 to 8 times as big of a parking lot than the building required. So in Weathersfield, 1 per 25 square feet is really, I ain't go look around at maps to see what the funeral homes look like. Probably most of them were built prior to these requirements, but that is a amazing spread. What could be the reason? You might think the planners that put these into place were using tarot cards or reading bird guts. I don't know, but it really led to some problems. It led to development types that we see all over the place that are maybe not what we actually want to see in our communities or what are best for our environment or tax base. I don't want to just pick on the capital region. I'm going to end here with this one. This is Woodbury, Georgia. It's a really small town. There's nothing there really. We often see these. I could have picked some examples from the region where we call them roughly right or precisely wrong. Hospital beds at 0.72 per employee. High school is 0.26 per student. This tiny town, and this isn't the only place I've seen with this, has 2 different parking requirements for helicopter land uses, heliports and helistops, different parking requirements. What's the difference? Hell if I know. Ha ha ha. It's funny, but it's not a laughing matter. It's my dad joke. I am a dad. This is the DNA of your city. And so it plays out how your city's built. We have places that are easy theoretically to get to and might be easy to drive to, but they're not places that you really want to be at. They're noisy, they're loud, they're dangerous. I mean, it's noisy and loud are the same word. Noisy, maybe smelly, they could be hot. And so this is played out in a way that has, over the last several generations, really framed not only our downtown cores, but everything around them. It's led to so much parking. We've mapped parking all around the country, the Parking Reform Network. We've looked at the 100 largest cities. On average, about 20% of your downtowns or central cities 20 to 25% are taken up by surface lots or structured parking. And those are often the best case scenario, because when you move out of the central city, a more recently built development will be probably 40 to 50% parking, right? A new shopping center will be a lot of parking. There are some folks in the build up to HB 5002 that mapped actually every central city and downtown in Connecticut. ctparkingreform.org is their website. I was speaking to one of them. They told me that in the capital region, the downtowns and corridors and main streets, 31.4% is land use is parking in that area, and you can check that out and see. So parking's this is not only a problem for land use, but it's also a problem because parking costs a lot. A parking space, it varies a lot. So no one knows how much a parking space costs until they build it. But surface space is probably in the thousands of dollars, from the mid like 5,000 to 10,000. Depends on how stormwater requirements and other factors. That doesn't include the land. Above ground space is somewhere probably between $30,000 and $50,000, depending on where you're building it. Sometimes it's a little less, sometimes it's going to be more. These prices do also include the pedestrian infrastructure that's built to serve the parking structure usually, or other things that might be built in as bells and whistles. You go below ground and you're probably doubling the price of an above ground structure. Construction costs are real. So if you build $1,000 in construction, it leads to about $10 in rent. A $40,000 parking space requires $400, and someone's got to make up that money every month to pay for it. So just as a rule of thumb, think about that, because people often say, how much does parking add to rent? And the answer is, well, it depends on how much the parking space costs, and just take every $1,000, and $10 for every $1,000 is a good rule of thumb. It's real money with real trade-offs. I use this example from Stamford, Connecticut. I didn't do it just for this example. They have a parking structure they built at the train station. It's a park and ride, cost about $90 million, I think, for 1,000 spaces. So about $88,000 for a car, just for, park and ride. Same city, Franklin Apartments, deeply affordable, permanently, required $9 million in subsidy, houses between 100, 120 people, depending on how many are in each household. So you can house a person in Connecticut for $77,000, or you can build a parking structure and park someone's car for $88,000. So how we decide to spend our money does reflect our values, and we are making choices all the time about how much we're requiring and how much we're spending on this. Parking spaces take up a bunch of space. I mentioned 300 to 400 square feet. When you look at that compared to the size of an apartment, often the amount of parking required can take up the same amount of space or more of a building. And the parking, when it comes especially to residential, is often the limiting factor in how much housing is built. It might not be the height of the building or the density. It's going to be how much parking you can fit on site reasonably. So this can really lead to losing, or maybe a project not getting built. I think someone else is going to talk about that after me more. I took out some of my residential slides, given that, the reforms are on the way. I'll mention that a little bit later too, but we do like to look at there's a census table for vehicles available by tenure. So I looked at the capital planning region. It was a census figure, how many vehicles are available to renter households in the capital planning region. And 51% have access to one vehicle, 23% have access to no vehicle. So 74% of the households in the region have access to one or zero cars. Your existing parking mandates, which I kind of looked at, seem to, for multifamily 1 or 2 bedrooms, seem to cluster around 1.5 to 3 parking spaces per apartment. So if you have a single parent who doesn't want to sleep in the same room as their kid, they're going to end up paying, and think back to that cost of the parking, they're going to end up paying additional rent to have that extra bedroom. I want to just briefly mention, when we think about who these people are, and you'll think about it when we also just think about accessibility and what the impacts are. I can strongly recommend this book by Anna Zievarts, When Driving's Not an Option. Non-drivers are everywhere. So when you think about who are the people who aren't driving, who are these people? There's a myriad reasons why they don't drive, from health reasons. Many people with disabilities can't drive or can't afford a vehicle. Younger and older people can't drive. And so even in the areas that you think are the least accessible for someone without a car, someone's living there without access to a vehicle. And the reason you might not see them is because they probably can't get out of their house much. So when we're trying to provide services for people in our communities, it's these people who actually need the services the most and need the opportunities and the choices. These land use have led to, these decisions have led to human scale versus automobile scale. This is in Wethersfield, a main street, the number of businesses compared to a nearby, more recent suburban type development, just thinking about what the scale is and how these are meant to be approached. looking over at Manchester downtown versus, the nearby Coles with a parking lot, how you can fit, an entire almost old Main Street into the parking lots for a newer development. So just thinking of how we're orienting our developments and what, it's not to say that there's not a place for auto-oriented development, but under existing codes, often this is mostly what you can build. Parking, a lot of the reason people think parking mandates exist is to reduce traffic congestion. I'm here to make the argument that parking is a battery for traffic. You build more parking, you have more traffic, you need bigger roads, more sprawl, other modes are slower and dangerous, more people drive, you demand more parking, and it just kind of goes around and around and around. Those roads are expensive. The other infrastructure that comes with all this parking is expensive too. Norman Garrick from UConn did a study years ago showing, this is Hartford from 1960 to 2000, and the amount of parking lots that were built on what was previously buildings. And that's a issue on its own. But when it rains, right, or snows and water comes off that parking, it goes into the rivers. And so this isn't just Hartford spending $2.5 million on maybe you might call a sewage subway. It's a subway sized tunnel. We have one of these in Portland, Oregon as well that we spent, I think, $1.5 or $2 billion to move water off of parking lots into treatment centers so we don't pollute our waterways nearby. Tremendously expensive beyond just these more apparent costs of how we can't build our city. This leads to low density, and I think just briefly thinking about how a parking lot requires the same amount of road, pipes, wires, cleaning, snow removal. All these factors are still the same expensive for a less dense versus a more dense development. And so while yes, a shopping center or a large home on a large lot might pay a large individual tax bill, a main street or an apartment building is paying much more per acre, which allows you to provide the services that your communities need to be to be great places to live and provide the services and amenities that people want and to be fiscally solvent. Briefly, this also impacts economic development and other choices. This is an example from Oregon prior to our parking mandate reforms. You have a very much needed adult foster care facility called Rudy Care Communities, 12-bedroom home, but was only allowed to have 5 patients living in there. This is for people who are end of life, often hospice care. Patients can't drive, but the code said that 4 stalls were required, and that property actually had 5 stalls, but 3 of them didn't count due to other requirements, like the parking couldn't be stacked, or the parking in the garage didn't count for the requirement. So this woman tried for years and years to expand these to have 7 additional patients, and ended up closing in 2023. And this is a story. These kinds of stories we hear all around the country. Parking's not a community benefit. I won't read this whole slide, but I do think we often think about, oh, let's get something in exchange for parking. And really, the building with less parking is providing the things I think that your communities actually value. We have a lot of goals in common around the country, depending on communities, maybe not all of them, but many of these, to reduce congestion, provide more affordable housing, have other mode share, clean air and water, GHG emissions. The impact of parking is negative on all of these. First, all the parking you have already supports the traffic that you have. And the more parking you build, you're going to have less money for other modes, less housing. And that's on top of the GHG, runoff, and urban heating, and the barriers to entry and poor tax performance. So that's kind of all the bad stuff. But there is a solution to this. The Shoup doctrine, Professor Shoup, who I mentioned up front, has 3 steps he promotes to have a better city. You get rid of your parking mandates, stop telling developers and builders how much parking to build, do your job as a city or town and manage your curbs if necessary, either by pricing or with other parking management. And then if you are pricing, you want to use that money for good things, to reduce car dependency or for economic vitality. Eliminating parking mandates is something that's happening. There are 86 cities in the U.S. today, including 2 in Connecticut at least, that have gotten rid of parking mandates for all their land uses, not just residential, citywide. Anchorage, Alaska is not on this picture because it doesn't fit. But these are cities in red states and blue states, cold places, hot places, places with good transit, without it, big towns and small towns. So this is happening, and the sky hasn't fallen in these places. We also have statewide reforms, as mentioned up front. Notable bills. Yours is the top of the heap currently, but it's been a year in 2025 of one-upsmanship on this, actually. Montana passed a bill that didn't require residential parking in smaller homes and cap their homes. Washington passed a bill that capped mandates at 0.5 and for certain land uses like daycares and also for small businesses, but that only applied in cities greater than 30,000. Now there's still a chance that North Carolina could pass House Bill 369, which is based on water quality and would ban parking mandates for all uses citywide. But we'll see. So this is not just in Connecticut. This is a trend, and there have been bills in previous years and other reforms in Oregon, California, Colorado are notable examples. So what should you do? And this is the crux, and I think this is going to be important for going forward also after the HB 5002 goes into place. Cities should mind their own business when it comes to parking. And by that, I mean, don't tell developers, entrepreneurs, their tenants, or their customers how much parking they need. Instead, mind your own curbs, manage spillover if necessary, and that sends appropriate signals to these entrepreneurs and developers about how much parking to build. I heard that many cities in the region, for example, don't allow overnight parking on street in residential areas. That's fine. That means that if someone wants to build more housing, they have to either find that parking or their tenants are going to have to find that parking. So, now if a city wanted to allow to, on a case-by-case basis, have permits, they could do so. Parking management, having meters or permits is a way to manage this issue as it comes up. I recommend getting ahead of the game, passing a policy for performance that's based on data. You say if the parking occupancy in an area or demand is above a certain rate, 85% is often, that leaves a space available on every block. You set the lowest price that leaves that space available. So it's the lowest fair price. This is a data-driven and responsive method that increases turnover and access for people to communities. So if you set a policy that says if we observe as a city over congested area, we'll implement some parking policies and deal with that. That also helps send a signal to the developers and entrepreneurs to manage their own business. Spend the money wisely. There's a thing here called parking benefit districts. This is taking a portion of the money of the net meter revenue or net permit revenue if necessary and spending it on local improvements. We have a booklet on this that we publish. There's a website just to say what are some of the things you spend money wisely on. People don't just want to think they're putting the money in the meter and it's going into a black hole or worse. Some great things are sidewalks and crosswalks, better lighting, transit passes. There's cities around the country doing mobility wallets with this, sometimes targeted at low-income households. Transit, so bus lanes, bus shelters. There's tons of things you can spend this money on. If it's a problem, the goal is not to raise the revenue, but to just make sure that you're aligning your goals of managing the curb with the situation. What happens when you get rid of parking mandates? What's going to happen when parking mandates go away? This is always the biggest question. First thing is nothing. I mean, it's the same city, right? Getting rid of parking mandates does not remove parking. It doesn't prohibit parking from being built. The places that people, the lifestyles that people enjoy now, the places that they live in and the places that they visit are still going to be there. It took us many generations to build this urban form. And if we change it, it's going to take a long time to change. So if someone currently likes to shop at a shopping center and they have parking at their home, they're going to still be able to do that. What does happen is you might get a little bit more of what you want and a bit less of what you don't, depending on what you do and don't want. In the cities where this has happened, these reforms are relatively new in a lot of places, but so one way you can look at what's going to happen is look back to things that were built before 1950, 1960 and look at those main streets and types of apartments, and you can get more of those. But in the cities that have adopted these reforms, Seattle and Buffalo are two. Seattle didn't remove the mandate citywide, but they found that the majority of new homes that were built were in buildings that would not have been permitted under the old rules. So it just means there was more that just means there were more homes than the parking would have allowed. But almost but the vast majority of the buildings still included some parking. Um, Raleigh, North Carolina did a reform a couple years ago. There's preliminary data out of there I've heard where, in fact, when they tally up for the entire city, the total number of parking spaces being built is pretty close, just a little bit less than what would have been required if you added it up for all the homes that were built under the previous mandates. They're just allocated differently. Some developers are building more because they want to or because they need to, and some are building less, and you might get a few things, especially early on, that have much less parking. You can do a lot more in the same space when you do this. This is in Fayetteville, North Carolina. 2 restaurants in the same space where in their downtown core they don't have commercial parking mandates. You have like 30 restaurants, right? So Olive Garden's got a very long menu. It's no Cheesecake Factory, but it also can't compete with all the variety that you might have in restaurants in a downtown core that doesn't have mandates. And I think that I really want to stress this is about choice and options. You'll often be concerned and probably hear from people that, our transit's not good enough to do this. And I think that can be true, but it also is the case that transit is only one way to provide access and abundance for people's lives. Transit is connecting people from where they live to where they want to shop or where they work. We also have centers and corridors infill, which is allowing for more homes to be built in places near where people work and have activities. And then there is also suburban retrofit and infill, allowing some activities to be maybe replaced back into communities like corner stores, hair salons, etc., to allow people to get around and access services a little bit easier than they would have before. This is a little bit of a side thing, but I do want to pitch this concept of accessory commercial units, or, these old style things. They're mostly in homes that were built, before 1950. This is how Main Streets often came about. You'd allow someone to turn their garage or have a storefront right in front. They could have a small business there. It's a neighborhood serving business. You couldn't do this if you have parking requirements. And in fact, you probably don't want a lot of parking at these because that would attract a lot of traffic, which is the main nuisance that people might not want to see. Almost done here. We have, because we have so much parking, we do have big opportunities. This is also in Arkansas where, downtown Rogers, parking lot the same size as the whole downtown. We saw a similar size in Manchester. These are places that going forward, once we relax the parking mandates, can be turned into new things. There are developers that are working on this. Monty Anderson in Duncanville, Texas, by strip centers, add some housing in them, breaks up the big boxes so that they allow for more commercial development, and kind of can maybe redevelop some of these larger lots into more modern Main Street kind of centers. These places might not be initially served by good transit, but they can over time provide that core that builds the density needed to support more transit. Parking reform is also key to the missing middle type of housing. That middle housing, the gentle density, ADUs, for example, accessory dwelling units, grandmother cottages, whatever they are called regionally. In Seattle, they were legal for many years. No one was building them. When they didn't require parking anymore, they took off. In places like California and even in Oregon, in Portland right now, this is the majority of the type of housing that's being provided during this during the it's not economic downturn necessarily, but during the high interest rates. These types of housing are still able to be built in an area of high interest rates as opposed to larger apartments. And I'm going to end with a little bit of a personal story. My grandmother was this is in East Chicago in the 1960s, 50s. She had 3 sons she was raising. She had a barber shop or a hair salon in her basement, Ruthie's Beauty Shop. This is the kind of thing that nowadays, if it's even legal, I'm going to pick on Windsor, but you would need 3 parking spaces per station, right? So there's no way my grandmother would have been able to provide 3 parking spaces for this one, chair, and you wouldn't need to necessarily. So I think we can look at planning for what we want. Do we want this type of of development that we've seen over the last 40, 50 years? There's a place for it sometimes, but this is really what we've been requiring. Or maybe the kind of main streets that we know people are very popular and people spend a lot of time and money in. So that's my presentation. Parking Reform Network, I'm Tony Jordan, and I hope to answer questions for you after Greg goes. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tony. That was incredible. Appreciate you joining us and sharing all that. That was huge. And for anyone wondering, there was a comment in the chat if the presentation is going to be posted to share with the rest of your commission. I'm going to shoot that around after once we get the recording and everything. I'll package it up and send it to you guys. So that'll be good. And with that, I'll pass it off to Greg.
Great. Everyone hear me and see the slides? All right. So thank you very much. I think it's a tough act to follow, and I know it's late. So I think the numbers. I think you have enough numbers for to understand what the why of parking now. So I'm going to go more into this from a developer's perspective, since that is my perspective. I am a real estate developer based out of Windsor. I'm a founder of Grava Properties. So we are focused entirely on revitalizing main streets and transforming communities through urban infill, right? So basically taking what was the traditional style of development in our core village centers and city centers and filling in the gaps. So we really focus on community focused design, only near transit, sort of using the best practices around sustainability and architectural qualities that are consistent with their environments. And you can see two of our projects here: Founder Square, which the first on the top right, the first project's delivering near the Windsor train station in 4 weeks, and then Enfield Station, which we don't have a name for yet, but we started the land, the site plan approval process in Enfield for the first 150 units of that project next to where the new train station is coming. So my background is in high-rise development, skyscrapers in New York and in Brazil, working for Tishman Speyer for 15 years as a senior executive. So I came back to New England, really in order to build this type of housing, because as I traveled around Northern Europe and around some other places, it really started raising money for projects in Brazil and New York. I started to realize something, which is that Connecticut, which has the most educated and wealthiest population in the United States, in terms of urban quality, really lacks compared to, say, any of the European capitals or even villages. You go to any village in Amsterdam, Spain, you have great density, walkability, and transit. And I really thought, well, we deserve better. We deserve to have the best of that. And so that's what I am focused on. But first, I'm going to talk about some bad news just to get it out of the way. So again, I, different from Tony, I'm just a real estate developer. I'm only focused in making projects happen, to improve these communities. And there's some real bad news there, right? Our communities here in Greater Hartford, in the capital region, really were everything we are trying to build now. They were dense, they were walkable, they were transit rich, they were gorgeous, right? Like, you had Mark Twain moving here because it was the most attractive place to live in the country, right? You have all of that, and it was, to some extent lost. And why did that? And not just I don't want to pick on Hartford or any big city. This is Windsor Locks, for example. You had this in every village. You had it in even the smaller villages. Unionville, you had a walkable urban center with boarding houses and restaurants and general stores and mass transit. This is something that we had all across the state. And just when it was getting to its peak, and I say peak, we're always, they would say, oh, we're younger than Europe. We don't have the things that Europe has. Well, we did. The problem is that the pattern of development, which is traditional, and when I say traditional, I don't mean from the 19th century to the 1950s. I mean, for the last 10,000 years of human civilization, of clustering around population centers. That all changed with what you see here as maybe a detail to this, but the advent of the car. And what did the car do? It did this, right? This is what happened, right? We took the spaces that we had that were, again, in the capital region, we can complain that, well, we don't have a city like Boston. We don't have a city like New York. We don't have these big job centers. Well, we had these things, but we had to tear them down. And we had to tear them down to make way for cars because of exactly what Tony was going into. The car takes up an extraordinary amount of space. And it's not just that it takes up space, it's where it took it up in this place and time, which is all of our centers, Hartford, New Britain, Windsor, Enfield, Windsor Locks, everywhere, right? And so when we went through this period of development, we started to demolish our improvements to make way for parking fields. And remember that term, improvements, it's not just our places of residence, our businesses, our common places. It's really our tax base, right? So remember that. And I want to recall something that Tony said here. You know, when you look at, and I'm going to borrow this again from Professor Garrick, when you look at this, if an alien was to arrive in any of our village centers, this is Hartford, but it is your town, they would think the thing that we produce and sell is parking, because it is the thing that we have the most of in the place that is densest, right? And so when you look at this and you see, and this is 1957, I mean, if you were to go back to, the late 19th century, there was none of it. You really see that the thing that we did was we demolished the city for the parking. And the problem with this from a real estate perspective is kind of simple and jarring at the same time. But I'm gonna borrow some help from a guy who's not the lead, he's not the guitarist from Queen. This is Isaac Newton. It's a physics problem. And I think when you approach this as a physics problem, it hurts more and the solution becomes clearer, which is that you cannot have the nice place and the parking at the same time because they occupy the same space. And in physics, you cannot have two things occupying the same space. If you remember anything from what I'm saying here, please remember this, is that anything that you want more of, you probably want more of it in the best place for that, which is your village center. And you cannot have that with the parking. You have to have it where the parking is, because all of your free space in your town center is parking. I want everyone to go back to their villages centers, and every town has it, right? It could be Rockville, it could be East Windsor, it could be, go back in, where the village center was, and anything you want to put there will actually be on a parking lot. It's the only thing to really be, unless it's a brownfield, but the vast majority of it is parking. And so if you want something like this, which is what all our villages used to look like, right? You can't have this and the parking, you have to choose, right? So that is, I think that's, the bad news is that all of that happened. And if you try to think of a place in which you're trying to have the stuff and the parking, again, no, not picking on Hartford, it's like this everywhere. This is what that looks like. This is what it looks like when you want to have the place where you work and the parking, the place where you live and you work and the parking. It is a market street without a market. It is a plaza without people. It is loading docks and breaks in the urban fabric that make it just completely inhospitable. Again, not picking on anyone. We did this everywhere consistently, right? So this is what one gets. And just to sum up the effects of this before I move on from this, because I'm getting to some good news here, that is an environmental crisis. I'm not talking about climate change. I'm talking about what Tony was talking about, that we have all of this impermeable surface where, rain falls on, parking fields that are dirty because of the gasoline from the cars and just washes into our environment. All of this was, a lot of this was cleared public green space, right? So we have the environmental crisis is largely based on this pattern. You have a fiscal crisis. We demolished the improvements. The tax base was demolished, right? And so, Hartford and other places are in a constant, every town, the wealthy towns, my town in West Hartford, constant fiscal crisis. And why is that? It seems like we're wealthy and yet we go from crisis to crisis because our improvements do not support our tax base. And this has caused a housing crisis, right? Because suburbanization in Connecticut, different from other parts of the country that seem like they're growing because they still have a lot of green fields to tear down and put up housing. Suburbanization has run its course in Connecticut. There is nothing left for Connecticut to, force to cut down to put subdivisions, which is why single family home development has ground to a halt in Connecticut. And then that leads to an affordability crisis, right? You have a, car dependency and other factors of sprawl just lead to the costs of common folks, right? Not just rent. I'm talking about other costs. It all gets passed on to the consumer, making things less affordable. The public health crisis we're in, you look at obesity rates and other things that are correlated with, sedentary lifestyle, given that you have to sit to drive everywhere, for on average, I think 45 minutes in the state. And the worst of all, a crisis of community. A lot of people, following sort of the bowling alone logic, a lot of people have lost, their community connections because it's just too hard to get where you're going for the community when you have to get off the couch, get in a car, drive and find parking to a place and be there in a suburban environment. So the culprit of this, unfortunately, is car dependency. And I'm really not talking about, suburbanization in terms of where everyone in this call, including myself, lives. I'm really talking about our village centers, right? Which is a specific subset of all this that has seen the worst of all of these factors. Okay, I'm done with bad news. All right, I wanted to get it out of the way. We're moving on to good news. And it is, in my mind, I've dedicated sort of the rest of my career to this. So it's very good news. And the good news is that there's a solution that builds community, that creates housing, that grows the tax base in the best way, which we'll get into, that reduces folks' costs, and not just for the folks that are benefiting directly from new development, but from everybody. That when a place is made more walkable, people that drove to it walk to it, right? Improves health outcomes for across the community and boosts sustainability, and that is urban infill development, right? I'm not talking about having a fight about taking, an East Windsor, or, Glastonbury historic farm and putting 50 units on it. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about taking your parking lots in your village center and building improvements on that. That's what I'm talking about. This is something that I believe is far less controversial than building housing where the infrastructure doesn't exist. That's not what I'm here for. I'm here for building it where all the infrastructure is already there, right? And so, great news. We have thousands of acres of urban developable land across all of our village centers that is currently parking. We have more than enough land to build all the housing to get us out of this crisis, to build the ideal walkable environments that we all, travel to see, which I'll get into and dream of. The land is not only all there, it's exactly where you'd want it to be. This site that you're looking at is a parking field in front of Bushnell Park, adjacent to the train station, next to the major employment centers in Hartford, right? But this exists in every village center of everyone on this call. This exists right in the heart of that center, right? Probably maybe the only place that you have transit in your towns is this, but like efficient train is this place, right? So that's very good news, right? And then, when you think about it on a smaller scale, this is just one example, but you can find this everywhere. There are so many lots that you would find that are small that really break up an urban fabric, and you need, and ideally you would build on. But look at, this is a typical New England lot, 50, 60, 70 feet wide, maybe 100, 120 feet deep. You cannot fit the parking around a viable building there. And so at some point, in some cases, and these are the urban cases, right? And when I say urban, I use the term urban. Rockville Center was urban, and maybe urban again. Manchester Center, that is urban. Windsor Center, right? Places where you can walk to things is urban. That have a street wall. You're gonna have to make a choice at some point. Would you rather have something here or nothing? Because you can't fit both the parking and the development on lots like this. Other good news, everyone wants this. All studies show across young, old, families, people want walkable centers. They want Disney World. So the number one vacation destination in this country is Disney World. Disney World is a place where you pay a lot to hand over your car and live car-free in a perfect urban environment with mass transit, right? The second biggest tourist destination is New York. The other thing, like you think about the places you go, Paris, one of the most walkable, the places you want to go on vacation, you pay exorbitant amount of money to take public transit, right? To walk to everything and be in the glory of a consistent and beautiful street wall. And then you come home, and most people that are advocating for anything, if they show up to town halls, they're advocating against the pattern of development that they go on vacation to visit. right? It's something that I think Europeans would be amazed that they're amazed that we do that, but we do it. And so I want to challenge everyone to think about, and this I think is the holy grail of real estate development for me, is what if we have the premise of all this parking discussion wrong? What if we think that we need the parking, right? Like most developers do. We need the parking, to make the project viable. And what does that mean? That means we need the parking in order for people to rent the property in order to make money doing so. How is that the case when the urban projects we have going on in this state, we spend $20 to $40 million to build a parking garage and then subsidize the developer to have 20% of the housing development be workforce housing? We gave him $20 million in a parking garage, $40 million in a parking garage. What if the development without the parking is actually better? And so instead of it being a discount, what if a car-free development in a more urban environment, because of the quality of the urbanism, what if it's actually a premium? In the market, I don't think there is a more pressing question in our real estate urban development market than that. Is pricing, what is the value of the housing without the parking? This picture, for example, this is from a project on a light rail station in Arizona, good transit, but still big site called Cul-de-sac. Built it without any cars, no parking. And everyone thought it was crazy. And now this has been repeated many places. They thought, okay, what's the discount? What's the discount that the developer will get for building all this housing, build twice as much housing? It's the best looking housing in that market because there are no cars, because you can create environments like this without any asphalt. In a hot place like the Phoenix area, this is actually like 15 degrees cooler in the summer because of the lack of asphalt. People are paying a premium for it because they have all of these great amenities there and the access to transit, right? If this is the case, then the math may be very different than we think it is. Because, to go to another picture of this, right? I mean, it's gorgeous urbanism, these places, again, because there's no car, there's no conflict. You have all the spaces for people. You think about an environment that is a premium environment. And when you think about your tax base, which I think is the principal preoccupation, I'd like you to remember a few numbers. First, the average single family home owner in the state pays about $10,000 a year in property taxes, right? Those are properties for families. The average child in Connecticut costs $22,000 a year to educate. So if you have 2 kids, the system is drawing $44,000 when you are paying in 10. The reason why that math works is because we have commercial development and folks that don't have kids that subsidize that. And so when you think about the housing we don't have, housing for families, almost all of our markets have a lot of housing stock. That housing is predominantly single family homes, right? So housing for families in theory is there. It's being occupied by singles because there is no alternative. We did not build apartments for 40 years in this state. It was banned almost everywhere for 40 years, right? And now only in the last 15 years has zoning caught up and started to even allow multifamilies, which is why there's a perception that a lot of multifamily is coming. We last year had 6,000 units of housing total in Connecticut delivered. We used to have 20 to 40,000 a year. And that 6,000 was a peak. Given new starts is so down that we're going to be much lower than that years forward. We in Connecticut, it'll be very difficult to satisfy all the housing demand, right? But the people we push out of our communities because of our housing policy are singles, childless couples, empty nesters, retirees. Those happen to be all the demographics that are growing in Connecticut. And those that do not draw on the Board of Education, which is the majority of the budgets in most of our towns. When you think about these apartments, I want you to think the following. A woman walking her dog, she lives in an apartment in Connecticut. If she lives in Connecticut, she's paying $6,000 of property taxes in a unit. No kids, right? The retiree paying $6,000 per for her unit in property taxes. And the urban infill development, all the infrastructure is there. There's no new roads. There's no new pipes. It's all right there in the street. There's no big infrastructure to follow these developments. It's already there. It's the center. That's where all the infrastructure started, right? So I would like everyone, I mean to sort of like challenge sort of the conventional wisdom on a lot of these things. And I want you to think about the place that you want, the place that your policy documents, your plan of conservation development, your zoning documents, what are those places saying they want in their village center? The things you want, the walkability, the diverse retail options and amenities close to your home, right? The beautiful green environment. You can only have that if we build that on the parking fields. And so if we want something, a future like this, I only see it going through building on our parking lots. And so, I'm very happy that these reforms are happening and happy to have a small part of it in my company. But I really do think that the future of Connecticut development, is along these lines. So just want to thank you for having me for the presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Once again, killer presentation, Greg. Thank you so much. That was awesome. All right. With that, I think we open up for Q&A for both Tony and Greg. If anyone has any questions they would like to ask. Sound good? Okay, we have a question in the chat from Elizabeth Vinnick from Canton. Why do developers and funders look for more parking / underwrite to minimum parking ratios to preserve options for sale and possible foreclosure?
So I would say this, if we were having this discussion 5 to 10 years ago, the discussion would be, why can't we finance mixed use development, right? Why do banks demand that we keep uses separate? So if you look at South Windsor, Evergreen Walk, there are apartments, a few blocks away from the retail, right? That sort of, and at the time that was developed, banks really demanded that type of development. Why? Because that is underwriting, right? It is underwritable. That that's been done a million times. You have the confidence that that can be done again. So what happened? Community banks. So in all of our regions, there's many community banks that are funding multifamily mixed use projects. They stepped up and started to fund this, mixed use projects with retail on the ground floor, residential upstairs, even some office, sprinkled in. And now banks see it as standard, right? So when Cul-de-sac was looking to finance their project, it was the same thing. You had to get banks on board. And the way they got on board was they did so many studies, to think, okay, what is the discount that the renters would pay to have that, to be in the housing without, without the parking. And so the lenders got comfortable with it. Of course, they have absolutely surpassed their expectation. And it's not just them. There are probably 20 projects like this around the country now, especially in Texas and Arizona, some in California, like completely car-free developments. Now the banks understand that, there is a population, not just to rent those spaces, but that those spaces, given their quality, they create car-free drivers. It's not that if we built a tower, let's think of an exercise in Hartford. If we built a tower in Hartford for 150 units with no parking, I mean, folks, the first iteration of folks would need to be set up in the park across the street and down the street, and they need to know there was some park. Abner Crone's project in downtown New Britain, there's no on-site parking, that's down the street. People get comfortable with that. And then it just becomes cash flow. So when you go to sell it, people say, you're going to need parking to sell it. When you sell it, investors look at cash flow. And if the cash flow is lower because of parking, which, the data does not show that is the case in these urban projects on transit, but if it is, they'll just value it less. You'll sell it at a capped value, what we call like a capitalization rate applied to your cash flow, right? If the cash flow is what matters for the sale, which is why I think it is so important that in Greater Hartford, in the capital region, we have pilot projects that the first iterations are going to be funded through community banks. They're probably going to have CMDA and some other like gap financing involved to finance them, to prove that the underwriting pencils, that the people exist to rent them at a value that can pay the debt. Once that's underwritten, the market follows it, because the universe of projects you could build when the parking requirement diminishes, grows exponentially. There are so many sites you cannot build on because there's just not enough space to build a building and the parking, a viable building and the parking. And so once the market becomes comfortable that, like in other places where this is happening, we're not inventing something here. Other communities have already done this. This really takes off. And so I would say we need to underwrite this kind of project in order for folks to start getting comfortable with the economics of it.
All right. I think Jen, your hand is up next.
So I had a couple of thoughts and a couple of comments, and maybe some would end up in questions. So the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about parking is being creative and really employing low impact development options for alternative surfaces for when we need to have some parking that we don't want to have as, bituminous. We've done it on some of our developments that are here to kind of cut down on some of the runoff. Developers sometimes struggle based on whatever their soil types are to keep the runoff on site, which I feel like we need to be more responsible with low impact development techniques to create areas where we have more areas of groundwater recharge. So, common interest community developments and multifamily developments tend to have interesting types of diversity in family networks. So I'll give you an example. One that I have near me has a garage and 2 spots in front of the single family unit. Now, that one of the families that happens to be in this development, and they're all different in terms of, who's actually living there, number of children versus not, happens to have a parent and a wife and husband and wife, their 2 children, the spouses of those 2 children, and the children of those 2 parent groups. And so there's more cars than there are spaces for that unique situation. So what I've seen happen that can be problematic is, this development has visitor spaces, which is great. Your overflow then goes into the visitor spaces, which can be problematic anytime anything is going on with any of the other units that do have visitors and they have overflow that comes out of their allocated spaces. So then, based on the fact that we reduce the impervious surface for emergency personnel access, fire trucks, but made impervious surface accommodations so that they could hop a curb if they had to get in there, they're still trying to navigate around these cars that are actually in a cul-de-sac that shouldn't be in a cul-de-sac, because we have a diverse amount of cars that are kind of overflow, and we can't accommodate that in this development, which then, you question, is that a safety concern? Sometimes it could be if your fire truck and apparatus can't maneuver. So that's one thought in terms of, we can allow the developer to reduce the spaces, but we may create situations like that. You never know. It could be 1 in a million. It could be something, depending on who chooses to live there, that could be a real problem. I don't know the answer to that. There probably isn't a good one. But, that also can affect snow shelving in a cul-de-sac, because then they're looking at where they're going to put their snow removal and have access to that. But then you have excessive cars also as a factor. There's also some places that we have in town that we're looking to expand development and types of development, but based on the types of soils that these developments have, the runoff cannot be managed on site, regardless of how many spaces you have or don't have, based on what your flow is going to be off your roof, and with any small amount of parking. And so that's really hard for these developers to attempt to do low impact development. One of my suggestions was, do we need to start doing other things, roof gardens, et cetera, that are better low impact development to help with that runoff? Or is that runoff, depending on how many spaces they have, given current regulations or with the reduction, going to improve the issue of having to pipe all of that runoff off site and then down into the regular public system? So that's a whole nother issue that depending on where your development, we did these plans of conservation and development years ago on zoning maps years ago when we first started with zoning. They're evolving, but are they evolving and commensurate with what makes the most sense for our infrastructure, for our low impact development opportunities based on what we have current zoning, or do we need to start looking more from the planning perspective on all of these collective concepts to make better decisions so that development is more appropriate? Also, businesses, I've noticed in our downtown, because parking is limited, we're not having an issue with the parking because some of our business hours are staggered. And so you have a barbershop that closes at X amount of time, say 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. Then your restaurants, which are getting the bulk of their business, they're now able to take advantage of those parking spaces. And so that overflow really does work because of the timing of what those businesses are. Now, we can't always predict who's going to go in if it's allowed in the zone, but we can try to coordinate some of that, does it make sense? Does it not make sense? How's it going to work? And then a couple other thoughts were, since COVID, things have really changed. Uber Eats is very popular. Use of Ubers for an alternative form of transportation is very popular. So before we were thinking we needed to have all of these spaces for all of our patrons at these businesses, but do we really? Because I feel like that reduction in a lot of situations is more appropriate. Yes, you need like a space for your Uber Eats driver to park that's close by. Yes, you need your handicap parking. But how many of your patrons now are being responsible because they don't want to drink and drive? And so they're using an Uber ride, or they're having someone drop them off and pick them up, which speaks to the reduction. So I think, looking at the big picture, and also, as we're expanding our housing stock, just making sure that we're not creating a burden for infrastructure as well as for our school systems, and really looking at zoning, because that is going to be a huge piece for whether our towns are going to be incurring costs in other places, not just a reduction in the parking and an increase in the housing. So I think there's a lot of factors for us to look at.
Can I just comment on some of that?
Absolutely. We'd love it.
So I think, when you're talking about the cul-de-sac, that is not, I think that is a whole different thing. I think in terms of parking reform in village centers, that is not I'm talking Main Street. I think the cul-de-sac is a different animal, requires a totally different thought process. And certainly the issues you raise are relevant on a cul-de-sac and not, probably not on a main street. So in terms of low impact sites, when you build on a parking field, what you do is you are taking impervious surface that is 100% dirty, right? Because it's cars on that's technically dirty water, right? Water that mixes with, exhaust and everything and then washes out, right? When you build on a parking field, what's interesting is that, you're building the actual building, and then the limited parking for the mixed use project in the village center, you're occupying the same footprint, but now the roof water is clean. And so the roof water can be used, to irrigate plants and other things, but it is clean water, right? Because it goes from the rain touching the roof and into the system, right? And doesn't touch the parking lot. So I think, it's a lower impact probability. So I would say in terms of these situations that you're talking about with, multi-generational folks in a home and a parking burden or something like that, I would just say in our developments, like in centers, when someone comes to look at the project, and I get this question a lot, it's like, well, what if they have 3 cars? Where are they going to park the 3 cars? And I'll tell you, they're not going to park them there. And not just that, they are not going to rent there. It is not for them. Because if you were to build all of that parking, you wouldn't build the housing. And so in our precious places where land is precious, which is, the denser village, New England village centers, there, it may be that a 2-bedroom has 1 parking space. It's like, oh, what if you're a couple and you have 2 cars? Then you're going to rent in the other 99% of the housing stock, that housing stock is for someone that has only one car, because then you can provide more housing stock. And so this is why a Main Street, applying things to Main Street is so specific. It has to be parking light, or else you're just not achieving the Main Street goals of like a vibrant street wall and, diverse amenities and all these things, because you're gonna have to build the parking. So I think it's different in a center, right? Now, business issues with parking, this is, I think, the most polemic thing one sees. And what, you look at West Hartford Center where I live, I live in West Hartford, the center just, is doing a public plan that is not really what the community thought it was going to be. And businesses really fought it, because of, parking concerns. The issue is that people look to a place like West Hartford and think, wow, this is like the New England urban village. It's not at all. West Hartford Center and other centers like this are entirely commercial. If you were to sum up the footprint in West Hartford of what is actually mixed use projects, it's nothing. It's 4 buildings. It's almost entirely commercial that has a massive parking requirement and a massive parking need, because people aren't walking to the restaurants from where they live. They don't live there. They're driving from the other communities that don't have that walkable center, and they want to enjoy it, and they have to drive to it. Like, the ideal is, I would say, not West Hartford today. It's, Rockville and Plainville and Windsor and East Windsor 80 years ago, where everyone lived above the commerce and lived adjacent to the commerce, right? All that was demolished. But so that the customer base primarily is in the village itself, right? You have a large base to sustain, the retail that others obviously can enjoy, but that actually lives in the center. So it's not so car dependent. And then the last thing I would say, when you talk about, potentially a burden, the math shows that in all of our communities, unfortunately, I live in a single family home. I'm not exempting myself. The burden is the single family home in terms of taxes, right? It's the single family home with children. That is the burden in terms of you are taking more out in services than you put in. Right. What I'm saying is I'm proposing a pattern of development that reduces the burden through, maintaining our college graduates and our empty nesters and people that would otherwise leave to stay in our communities, enliven them, and support our tax base and our school systems, by that demographic that doesn't have the children.
Thank you. All right. I think Chris, you have your hand up next.
Hey there, Kristen Antonio of Enfield Planning and Zoning. Probably a little familiar to you, Greg.
Hi.
So I have a question. Feel free to jump in, Greg. But I have a question. I'm going to direct first to Tony. So just to set up the context, we have a fairly decent size village center, which is past its prime, but everybody is very excited to see redeveloped and improved. It's been a town goal for a while now, but the train station, planned train station is gonna make it even more real. So what I want to ask is, there's been a lot of town leadership that's expressed a lot of interest in building a parking garage, basically with the mentality, I think, of if you build it, they will come. And just for context, the town already has several municipal lots in the village center, across the village center, which are underutilized. And there's been a parking study 10 years ago to prove that. So my question is, how do you approach that? A town that seems to kind of be grabbed by the allure of a parking garage without having any parking management today, but wanting to really develop and invest in their town center.
That's a great question, and we see this quite a bit. I mean, I think a lot of that is, I think, the first thing that's one of the solutions people think, right? Is we can build our way out of this, and I think that you can't. I think that if you're not, part of it just goes to cost. Like, how much is it worth it to build this parking, and how utilized will be and how many people can you get to a space by driving. And even if you built that garage, like what's that going to do to the local traffic patterns? So I think, I mean, I feel like the main strategy or the main discussion needs to be, you know, I mean, if a, is if you can't charge, if on street, we all know on street parking right in front of the destination, the spot right in front of the restaurant is the most valuable one, right? That's the one you want. If you could choose to drive down the street and park directly in front of your destination and walk right in, you would do that. And if you're going to build a parking structure that's a block off that someone has to drive around, a lot of people don't like parking structures as much. Um, and that's going to cost, you know, at $40,000, you know, you're going to need $400 a month. Like figure out like just what the math is, how much it costs to support each space in that parking structure, and think like, if someone's not willing to pay that amount to park directly in front of the restaurant on the street, they're absolutely not going to be willing to pay to park in the parking garage. Like the parking garage should cost less than on street ideally, because it's less preferable. So if I mean it's a fiscal responsibility issue. If you're sitting now, if the city feels there's investment and they're willing to spend this money on it, and you can't stop them, you know, I mean, there's examples around the country of cities that, you know, go broke or have serious issues with parking garages that they spent a bunch of money on, that you can look to as an example. But you know, so I guess I think I've posted about this. I think making people aware of the per space cost, because most people just don't do the math and break it down, really look at what it needs to support per hour, and think about if there are incremental approaches that you can go. If you can start charging for parking, you know, sometimes a lot of that congestion clears up automatically. So like we have an issue kind of where we've tried nothing and we're out of ideas in a lot of places, you know, and the first thing we want to do is just build these lots. And I think to Jennifer's point, you know, like there are hard problems that come about. My opinion from having read about this and looked at it is that in more cases than not, you know, building a bunch more parking or requiring a bunch more parking causes its own problems, that it's like taking 2 steps back for every step you take forward, and managing your curbs and letting the businesses and the developers kind of figure out what they're trying to do, you know, allows your other policies that you're doing. It's in alignment with your pro growth policies or your fiscal responsibility policies. And so everything kind of works a little bit better. I think like parking reform is just like removing a barrier to some of your other things you're trying to do, where the current mandates, you know, are undermining that. So I don't know if that's like super helpful, because I think that the main thing is you're going to have to, you know, like just look at it long and hard. And the main argument is it's not fiscally responsible. Plus, I would say, given just as was mentioned, Uber, Lyft potentials, changes in transportation, like you're really making a bet on a parking garage that's really, you know, it's a little sketchy. I mean, if Waymo shows up in your town and people start taking it, you know, like, are they going to really be willing to park in that garage? So what did you spend that for? And last thing I'll say is just the physics point that Greg made. You know, if you want more people in your downtown, you can't have them all come there in cars. You have to find other ways for them to get there. And that includes transit. It includes allowing them to live closer to that area. Shuttles. I mean, for the amount that you're going to spend on a parking garage, you can, and you don't have to create a system that works everywhere at once. You know, you can have a couple shuttles, and like 1 week for a festival, they go to one part of town and pick people up, and then they go to another part of town, and you start just building in that muscle of people not always driving everywhere. And I think you can build up, you know, different ways for people to get around. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, feel free to hit me up later. We could talk more, but there's no one shot, other than I think the math is the best you got.
That makes sense. And I mean, if you don't mind, maybe a follow up to throw it to Greg. I mean, from a developer position, I mean, you do have kind of a niche. At least for now, it's a niche. But from a developer position, is this, would that be a major kind of selling point to bring in investment? Is this would let's say a lack of a parking garage in a town center really dissuade future development?
No, not at all. I mean, I think, it is Thompsonville, which is the village that, Chris is talking about, is a specific case. I would say not even just in Connecticut, but I think, in New England, it's both, a very typical sort of older mill village, but just the density of this place, to give people an idea, I think it's like 20,000 residences. It's like a top 5 or 6 densest place in Connecticut. Um, and the retail there, which there's some vacant storefronts, there's some good retail. If you summed up all the retail there, I mean, 22,000 or 20,000 residences would more than support it. So it's actually the rare case where the people are there, and it's really, I think people, getting people to move around and filling in the urban gaps and making other infrastructure improvements. The return of the train, obviously, but it's got a gorgeous strip of waterfront there. There's so many great amenities there. It's really getting folks, to move around there better. I mean, if there's any place in Connecticut where bike lanes could be, or, bicycle infrastructure could be such an important part of the mix, it's there. I mean, it's a long strip, reasonably flat along its main axis. And then there's 20,000 people there. I'll tell you, there's no other community I've seen as many people on bikes in Connecticut relative to its size than there. So it is a case where, yeah, I think the garage there is it's in the interest of a garage developer's interested in it, because the idea is the train coming, it could be an asset, to that village. But I mean, it's hard for me to say that a parking garage is the solution to any problem, right? I think the need for a parking garage is sort of, you've already reached a planning failure, I think, at that point, to some respect, just because of the enormous cost of it.
Thanks. That's really helpful kind of perspective in terms of focusing within the village and the folks that live there today, and even more folks that could live there with a little more housing. Thanks.
All right, and I think for the sake of time, we'll go one more question. I just want to check with Christopher from Weathersfield. I know you had your hand up. If you had a question, feel free to ask. And if not, I'll go to a question in the chat. Going once, going twice. Okay, sold to Elizabeth. Elizabeth in chat asks, Tony, could you talk about what small town villages have put in place to implement effective spillover management programs? We hear about impact from potential spillover at our meetings all the time. And I think this gets to a little bit of what Jen was talking about as well.
This is from commercial or residential primarily? I mean, or both?
It's both. It's a mixed area.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, I think the answer, unfortunately, is stuff that most people think they don't want to hear, right? Which is management. I mean, well, you can do a couple things. You can divert, right? You can make it difficult for traffic to get into neighborhoods, right? Like, so that's one option, is just traffic management. Wayfinding also to help people, wayfinding and incentives to help people find appropriate parking that's nearby, improving the walkability from those places, right? That's one of the reasons the parking benefit districts work nice, because a lot of places I've been to, there's parking nearby, but no one wants to park there because it's in a dark parking lot with a nasty street. And so, like, if you can improve that. I saw a long time ago, there was one of these planning advisory service things where it was like, you can never build too much parking in a shopping center, but no one will walk more than 300 feet from the front door, unless you make the walk nicer. So, like, I think that's a key. And then management, either whether they be permits, if it's residential, or time stays. But I think one thing to look at is kind of trying to flip the script. The nice thing about parking benefit districts and reinvestment is, can you get, and it requires the city having, or the town, the municipality having enough, credibility, but can you convince, like, this is not a bad thing to have, like, someone wanting to park on your street if you can charge them, or either they're coming to the community to invest in it, or if there's enough people that want to go there that you can use permits or meters, that's revenue for your city that you can have, right? But the city has to be credible enough to show that they can manage it. So I think, like, the basic management schemes are time, stays, meters, permits. But I think there's a lot of other things, like I said, diversion and just trying to get people there in other ways. That's, there's tons of consultants or parking management around that. There's several. Also, I'll point out that and I'm guessing this will pop up in Connecticut too, but there's Colorado and Oregon both have, and other states that have done reforms are starting to put out these handbooks that are kind of like have parking management tips for municipalities. And it might be worth, now that the state has done this reform, going and saying, hey, we want some technical assistance. We want to, we want some guidance for how to implement parking management, or especially when you have a good regional government, like thinking about like, are there steps where, so you're not like, it's a unilateral disarmament, like one place isn't just raising their rates so then everyone goes somewhere else. Maybe there's like a plan for that. So yeah.
All right. Thank you guys so much.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Please. Yeah.
Which is, I think I hear all the time about, my place, my village has a parking problem. There is a parking problem. I would say if there's a parking problem, it's too much parking, but you don't have a parking problem. I would say the best case scenario, and I'll leave sort of last thing I'll say, the best case scenario for all of our villages, centers, is a parking problem. There is no desirable place that you go that does not have a parking problem. Parking problem means there's stuff to do, right? It means that there's enough stuff that you can't park right in front of it because there's too much good stuff to do, right? So I think the best case scenario for us in all of our communities is to develop to the point of having a real parking problem.
All right, I'm a nerd for this stuff, so I absolutely love that. But thank you guys so much for coming. I know it's at least late for you, Greg, but Tony's on the West Coast, so a little bit better for you. But still, thanks for going out of your way to really help us out. I see, Tony, you're sharing your contact info in the chat. I'll be sure to, if Greg, you're cool with it as well, I'll include your contact info, just your email. Along with the package that I mentioned with the presentations and the recording, all that good stuff. And feel free to share it with the rest of your commissioners. But with that, appreciate you guys so much. Thank you. I'll be in touch. We wish you well, but feel free to sign off. We'll get into RPC business now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys.